Research Association poll found that less than 1% of police chiefs around the nation, who you would think would favor the death penalty, actually think that it is a deterrent against crime, and they believe that it increases crime. One of the reasons is because as long as we pay for the death penalty, we can't pay for programs of rehabilitation and for prisons that have actually shown any sign of making a difference. Richard Dieter, the director of the Death Penalty Info Center, told the New York Assembly on January 25, 2005, that death penalty trials are 3 to 5 times longer than other homicide trials. They have to be because you obviously need bigger burdens of proof. The problem is that the Dallas Morning News now tells us Texas spends an additional $2.3 million per death penalty case than it would for life in prison cases. Florida, according to the Palm Beach Post, spends $24 million per case. As a result, Florida had to release 8,000 inmates early because it simply couldn't afford to keep them. When if it didn't have the death penalty, it could be giving people the terms that they have earned and the terms in prison that have actually been shown to deter future crime. The Sacramento Bee notes that California spends $100 million per execution. $78 million of that is just on the trial itself, not on the appeal system that people would like to make you believe cost us our time and our money. Now the response to this would be, well, the trial should be less long and there should be less of an appeal system. But the problem is that the George Mason University Civil Rights Law Review of spring 2006 tells us that 2/3 of all death penalty convictions are overturned by the states that gave them and usually by the judge that oversaw them. You want to know the reason why? First of all, because most of the lawyers are incompetent, and in half of those cases were discovered to have not shown proof of innocence in these cases. And the second reason is because it is demonstrated time and time again that the prosecution deliberately suppressed evidence. One of the biggest problems that faces us with the death penalty is that it is a political advantage to talk about it. It gives you a way to say I'm tough on crime and not think about all the numbers that tell you countries that have the death penalty have higher crime rates because they give up everything else for a system that simply doesn't deter. The problem is, it is such a politically moving message, especially when we think about the stories of the past victims without thinking about the future victims that death penalty is creating. And when we listen to those stories, we stop forgetting about the real problems with the system. Time and time again, we hear that the death penalty is okay because we've got science. You know what? With DNA, we're never going to convict anyone falsely. But as Mark Furman tells us in his book, Death and Justice, by 2000, we've taken 8 people off of death row because of faulty DNA evidence. In fact, because, as Brian told us, defense aren't giving the money they need, they can't hire medical experts. So when something goes wrong, there's nothing you can do. Barry Scheck in the Drake Law Review of spring 2006 knows that 75% of the cases that the Innocence Project has tried to review the DNA material in, they can't, because the DNA material has somehow disappeared. In fact, the biggest problems that go on with what exactly the prosecution is doing when it needs expedient death sentences in high-profile cases are absolutely terrifying. Harris County in Houston is responsible for 10% of all people sent to death. Now the problem with Harris County, we know thanks to Houston Channel 11, is that not a single person in its crime lab actually met the training or education requirements to be a DNA analyst. In fact, only one of them had completed the college courses. The problem was so bad that the Texas Department of Public Safety had to shut it down and is putting 1/3 of its cases up for review. But the cases it's not putting up for review are the people who have died because of the Houston Crime Lab. Because, quote, it's too expensive to find out whether or not those who have died deserve to die or not. Time and time again, we're relying on science when both sides don't have equal access to that science. And when time and time again it's shown that stupid mistakes and sometimes deliberate mistakes has sent people to death row. And for that reason, it is all too clear that as long as we keep the system a penalty, we are making too much of a risk in putting innocent people at life for crimes that no one can really prove that they did in some instances. And those who perhaps did commit the crime and are put to death row, their death is doing absolutely nothing to keep other people free. And in fact, their death is doing so little to keep us safe that it is costing the rest of the justice system. But the final thing that death penalty proponents love to talk about are victims' rights. They would like you to believe that every family member of a victim desperately wants for the murderer to die. And perhaps in an innate way, most of them do. I can't imagine that you wouldn't. But what's important is that there are hundreds of family members of victims who have come out and spoken out about their opposition. In fact, Not in Our Names, in its 4th edition in 2003, featured people who had family members that they lost in 9/11 and in the Oklahoma City bombing, who said that they didn't want those people to be put to death because it was only making the problem of future victims worse, because it wouldn't bring their loved one back, and because the death penalty is such a long and trying process, and at the end all you get is another dead body, that none of those people believed that it would have provided them with closure. In fact, Mark Furman tells us that almost half of the families in Oklahoma City bombing were opposed to McVeigh's execution, and less than a third of the family members voted to go and watch McVeigh get executed. If there are crimes that people believe some people should be put to death with, they always list Timothy McVeigh. But to say that his victims wanted that is to take their pain and use it for a political message. And to talk about the pain of the families of the victims who were killed by murderers who do deserve punishment that will help society in the long run. To talk about their pain and not talk about the pain of the future families that will suffer under this system. And to not acknowledge the pain of the families of innocent men and women who have watched their family members die over decades on death row is simply to be dishonest and not look at both sides of the question.
Good evening. Again, I would like to thank all of you for being here tonight, for giving us this opportunity to have this little friendly back and forth with each other. I'd like to thank our opponents for also giving us that opportunity. The first thing I would like to bring up is what they mentioned about deterrence. One of my favorite quotes is, "The test for deterrence is not whether executions produce lower murder rates, but that executions produce fewer murders than if the death penalty did not exist." Simply put, there's no way to see if deterrence is going to affect a person based on capital punishment. You can't say, for example, because capital punishment exists in one state and not in another state, that I'm able to read a potential murderer's mind and say, well, now that the death penalty exists, he's not going to kill somebody. Or now, if there is no death penalty, he will kill them. But another quote I'd like to say is from Professor John McAdams at Marquette University, the Department of Political Science. He says on deterrence, "If we execute murderers and there is in fact no deterrent effect, we have killed a bunch of murderers. If we fail to execute murderers, and doing so would have in fact deterred other murders, we have allowed the killing of a bunch of innocent victims. I would much rather risk the former. This to me is not a tough call." Another point that's related to deterrence is recidivism rates. Now, from the best our research has